My name is Rowena Sarah, and I am 32 years old. 17 years ago, my own parents sat in a high school guidance office and refused to sign my advanced chemistry waiver. My teacher looked me in the eye and said science was a boys' club. My parents agreed. They told me my only job was to pick home economics and stay out of the way so my older sister could shine. They cut off my college fund. They erased me from their lives. For 17 years, I was the embarrassing daughter who played with test tubes in a basement while my father built a $400 million pharmaceutical empire. Then last Tuesday, the flashes of camera lenses bounced off the glass walls of the B. Sarah Institute of Neuroscience. My research team had just announced the stabilization of protein RS7, a breakthrough treatment for Alzheimer's disease. A reporter from a major medical journal leaned into the microphone and asked, "Who inspired me?" I looked past the crowd, straight into the back row. Sitting in an aisle seat was my father, Richard, Sarah, the CEO of Apex Pharmaceuticals. His face was the color of ash. He was staring at the data on the projector, realizing that my new protein did not just treat the disease better than his flagship drug. My data proved that his multi-billion-dollar pill actually accelerated neural decay. He watched his entire corporate legacy evaporate in real time. I leaned into the microphone and answered the reporter. I said I was inspired by everyone who told me I could not do this. Before we get into exactly how I dismantled his empire without breaking a single law, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Sophia Told Stories. But only do this if my journey truly resonates with you. Drop your age, your city, and your local time in the comments below. I want to know where you are right now. Now let me take you back 17 years to the manicured, stifling suburbs of Greenwich, Connecticut. It was a Tuesday morning inside the sterile, brightly lit office of my high school guidance counselor. The air smelled like stale coffee and expensive perfume. My mother, Patricia, sat with her legs crossed. Her gold bracelets clinked together as she dismissively waved away my application for the state science fair. Across the desk sat my chemistry teacher, Mr. Harrison, a man who wore his arrogance like a tailored suit. He slid my application back across the polished wood and smirked. "Science is for boys, Rowena," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You lack the analytical rigor for this path. Pick home economics. Learn to bake a pie." I waited for my parents to defend me. I waited for my father to use that booming boardroom voice he used to intimidate rival executives. Instead, Richard Sarah adjusted his silk tie and nodded. "Mr. Harrison is right," my father said. "We are not wasting tuition money on a pipe dream. Chloe is already tracking toward a business degree. We need to focus our resources on the daughter who can actually contribute to the Apex legacy." They were talking about my older sister, Chloe, the compliant pageant daughter who never questioned a single order they gave. As I sat there, sinking into the cheap fabric of the counselor's chair, I realized the cold, hard truth. My family did not want to protect me from failure. They wanted to prevent me from succeeding. They were terrified I might outshine my father in his own field. That night, at 2 a.m, I packed a single duffel bag and left a forged transfer form on the kitchen counter. I walked out into the cold, dark street, knowing I would never sleep under their roof again. The guidance counselor office at Greenwich Preparatory Academy always smelled like lemon floor wax and quiet desperation. It was a sterile, square room designed to process teenagers into acceptable Ivy League commodities. I sat in a rigid plastic chair that pinched my shoulders. I was 15 years old, and my future rested on a single sheet of paper lying flat on the mahogany desk in front of me. It was an advanced placement chemistry waiver. I needed a parental signature to bypass the standard biology track and enter the upper-level laboratories. I had spent my entire summer in the public library devouring organic chemistry textbooks while my peers went to sailing camps. I scored a 98 on the preliminary placement exam. The data was undeniable. I belonged in that lab. My parents sat on either side of me, framing me like wardens. My father, Richard Sarah, checked his platinum Rolex. He was a man who viewed his family as a subsidiary of his corporate portfolio. As the vice president of research and development at Apex Pharmaceuticals, he dealt in billion-dollar patents and high-stakes clinical trials. At home, he dealt in strict compliance. He wore a charcoal suit tailored to intimidate, and his jaw was locked in a permanent state of impatience. Beside him sat my mother, Patricia. She was a woman who engineered her social standing with the exact same ruthless precision Richard used in his corporate boardrooms. Her posture was flawless. She wore a cream-colored silk blouse and stared straight ahead, treating my academic ambitions like a tedious administrative error she had been called in to correct. The heavy wooden door opened, and Mr. Harrison walked in. He taught the advanced science classes and treated his laboratory like a private fraternity. He was a tall man with sharp features and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He did not look at me. He did not glance at my test scores sitting on top of my file. He looked directly at my father. It was a silent exchange between two men who understood the hierarchy of their world. Mr. Harrison sat down behind the desk and folded his hands over my application. "Richard, thank you for taking the time to come down here," Mr. Harrison said, using my father's first name to establish an immediate alliance. "Patricia, you look stunning as always." My mother offered a practiced smile. "Let's make this quick," she said. "We have a charity luncheon at the country club in an hour." Mr. Harrison nodded and finally tapped his index finger against my waiver. "We are here to discuss Rowena's course load for the fall semester. She has requested an override to enter the AP Chemistry program. As you know, this is an intensive track. It requires a specific type of dedication and a highly logical mindset." I leaned forward, gripping the edge of my seat. "I got a 98 on the qualifying exam," I said. My voice sounded too thin in the stifling room. "I memorized the periodic table in 7th grade. I have already read the first 3 chapters of the syllabus." Patricia sighed. The sound of her heavy gold Cartier bracelets clinking against the glass desktop echoed through the small room like a gavel striking wood. She pushed the waiver back toward the counselor with a single manicured finger. "Rowena is going through a phase," she said, her tone flat and dismissive. "She thinks wearing safety goggles and smelling like sulfur is a personality trait. We are not indulging this." I turned to Mr. Harrison, expecting him to defend his own subject. I expected him to point at my test scores and explain that empirical evidence mattered more than my mother's social schedule. Instead, Mr. Harrison leaned back in his leather chair and offered me a patronizing smirk. "Science is a boys' club, Rowena," he said. His voice was smooth and unapologetic. "The upper-level labs require a level of analytical rigor that you simply lack. The boys in my class do not fold under pressure. They do not get emotional over failed experiments. You would slow down the entire cohort. Do yourself a favor. Pick home economics. Learn how to manage a household. It will serve you much better in the long run." The words hit my chest like physical blows. I waited for my parents to intervene. I waited for my father to use his booming boardroom voice to tear this teacher apart for insulting his daughter. I looked at Richard. I begged him with my eyes to look at my scores, to look at the undeniable proof of my intellect. Richard, Sarah, adjusted his silk tie. He did not look angry. He looked relieved. "Mr. Harrison makes a valid point," my father said. His voice was cold and measured. "Apex Pharmaceuticals does not throw funding at high-risk investments. We allocate resources where they guarantee a return. This family operates on the exact same principle. We are not wasting tuition money and our valuable time on a pipe dream." "But I earned the spot," I whispered. My throat tightened until drawing a breath felt like swallowing shattered glass. I did the work. "Doing the work is irrelevant if you are in the wrong field," Richard snapped. "Look at your sister. Chloe understands her lane. Chloe is building the Apex legacy. They always brought it back to Chloe. My older sister was 2 years ahead of me. She was a former teen pageant winner with a flawless smile and a terrifying ability to echo whatever opinion my father held. Chloe was already tracking toward a business degree at a pristine university. She was compliant. She was predictable. She was a safe investment. My parents paraded Chloe at corporate galas like a trophy, while they hid my science fair ribbons in the back of a drawer. I looked at my father again, and suddenly the picture snapped into focus. I saw the tiny micro-expression at the corner of his mouth, the subtle relaxation of his shoulders. He was not agreeing with Mr. Harrison because he thought I would fail. He was agreeing with him because he was terrified I might succeed. Richard Serra built his entire identity on being the smartest person in the room. He was the sole scientific genius of the family. If Chloe pursued business, she was a complementary asset. But if I pursued chemistry, I became competition. If I entered his domain and excelled, I would threaten the fragile ego he hid beneath his expensive suits. My family did not want to protect me from academic failure. They wanted to prevent me from outshining my father in his own field. They needed me to stay small so he could stay large. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of polite handshakes and quiet betrayals. They did not sign the waiver. They enrolled me in home economics and a remedial study hall. The car ride home was entirely silent. We ate dinner in the grand dining room with nothing but the scrape of silver forks against porcelain plates to fill the void. They treated the matter as closed. They assumed they had successfully pruned the wild branch of their perfect family tree. They underestimated the roots. At 2:00 in the morning, the house was silent. The only sound was the distant hum of the central air conditioning. I stood in the middle of my dark bedroom. I did not turn on the lights. I pulled a canvas duffel bag from the back of my closet and unzipped it. The metallic sound of the zipper felt like a starting gun. I did not pack my expensive dresses. I did not pack the jewelry my mother bought me to wear to her country club events. I packed 3 pairs of jeans, a handful of shirts, and every single science textbook I had hidden under my bed. I packed the safety goggles Patricia mocked. I packed my notebooks filled with chemical equations and hypothesis drafts. I walked downstairs, moving like a shadow through the silent hallways of the house I grew up in. I stepped into the sprawling custom kitchen. The moonlight filtered through the skylights, illuminating the pristine marble countertops. I pulled a piece of paper from my jacket pocket and placed it flat on the kitchen island. It was a district transfer form. I had stolen it from the guidance office before leaving. I picked up a pen and carefully forged my father's bold, sweeping signature on the bottom line. I left the paper right next to the designer coffee machine where I knew he would find it at dawn. I slung the heavy duffel bag over my shoulder. I walked out the back door and stepped into the freezing autumn night. I did not know exactly how I was going to survive the next week, but as I walked down the long paved driveway, I knew one thing for certain. I was never going to shrink myself for them again. The Greyhound bus rattled over the cracked asphalt of Interstate 81, vibrating deep into my bones. I pressed my forehead against the freezing glass, watching the manicured lawns and gated driveways of Connecticut dissolve into the rugged, overgrown woods of upstate New York. I had $42 in my pocket and a canvas duffel bag packed with textbooks. The heater on the bus was broken, and the autumn chill seeped through my thin jacket, but I did not shiver. The cold was a welcome distraction from the hollow ache in my chest. My destination sat at the end of a long dirt road in Ithaca. The property looked like nature was slowly reclaiming the timber frame. Wild ivy crept up the wooden siding, and the front porch sagged under the weight of decades. This was the home of Beatrice Sarah. She was my father's older sister. 30 years ago, the family presented her with a choice: marry a prominent investment banker to secure a corporate merger, or forfeit her trust fund. Bea chose a doctoral program in plant genetics. They erased her from the holiday card list and never spoke her name again. She was the family ghost. I knocked on the peeling red door. Bea opened it, wearing a faded flannel shirt and soil-stained gardening gloves. Her silver hair was tied back in a messy knot. She looked at my duffel bag, then looked at my face. She did not ask why I was there. She did not reach for the telephone to call her brother. She simply stepped aside and pointed toward the kitchen. The inside of her house was a living laboratory. Textbooks lined the walls from floor to ceiling, stacked in precarious towers. There were no decorative throw pillows or crystal vases. The air carried the sharp, pungent smell of nutrient agar incubating in glass petri dishes. They rested on the kitchen counter right next to a chipped ceramic mug half full of cold black coffee. This was a sanctuary for the curious. It was the exact opposite of the sterile, silent mansion I had just fled. 3 days passed. Every time a car drove down the dirt road, my stomach tightened. I waited for the police sirens. I waited for the frantic pounding on the door. It never happened. I walked to an ATM at a local gas station and checked my debit card balance. My parents had contacted the bank and frozen the account containing my meager babysitting savings. The digital screen read 0. But they did not file a missing persons report. A runaway daughter would invite uncomfortable questions at the country club. It would draw investigative journalists to the Apex Pharmaceuticals corporate headquarters. Richard and Patricia weighed my physical safety against their social standing and chose to protect the stock price. I was not missing. I was officially exiled. Bea sat across from me at the kitchen table examining the forged district transfer document I brought. She picked up a blue pen and signed her own name on the Guardian line using an old electricity bill to establish local residency. The local public high school was underfunded and overcrowded. The chemistry lab had broken Bunsen burners and outdated safety manuals. None of that mattered. B gave me the only thing I actually needed, which was unrestricted permission to try. I set my sights on the state science fair. For 8 months, I operated on 4 hours of sleep a night. I took a job at a local diner scrubbing greasy pans to pay for chemical reagents and glass slides. I used B's kitchen as my staging ground. We built a makeshift centrifuge out of a salvaged ceiling fan motor and duct tape. I spent my weekends analyzing cellular degradation patterns in plant tissue, mapping the exact microscopic mechanisms of decay. While Chloe was attending expensive standardized test prep courses paid for by Richard, I was teaching myself advanced statistical analysis on a second-hand laptop missing 3 keyboard letters. The state competition took place in a cavernous university gymnasium in Syracuse. The air was thick with the smell of industrial floor wax and teenage anxiety. Most students stood beside elaborate glossy presentation boards funded by their parents' wallets. Their mothers handed them bottled water and adjusted their collars. I stood alone, wearing a thrifted wool sweater that itched my neck. My presentation board was made of repurposed cardboard covered in dense, hand-drawn diagrams and raw data tables. The panel of judges approached my station, holding their clipboards. They were university professors, accustomed to dealing with polished, rehearsed high schoolers. They asked me a standard question about my methodology, expecting a memorized paragraph. I gave them a 10-minute clinical breakdown of enzyme inhibitors, citing 4 separate peer-reviewed studies from the previous decade. I watched the condescension drain from their faces. They stopped looking at my cheap sweater and started looking at the data. They asked harder questions. I answered them with surgical precision. When the head judge called my name over the crackling public address system for the first-place grand prize, I did not cheer. I walked onto the wooden stage and accepted the heavy blue silk ribbon. I felt the weight of it in my palm. This victory did not belong to the Sarah family legacy. It belonged to the girl they threw away. The next morning, I walked to the post office. I bought a standard, padded envelope. I folded the blue silk ribbon carefully and slid it inside. I wrote Richard, Sarah, Vice President of Research, Apex Pharmaceuticals on the front in bold black ink. I left the return address entirely blank. I dropped it into the metal slot and listened to the satisfying thud as it hit the bottom of the bin. I pictured his secretary handing him the envelope. I pictured him opening it in his pristine corner office, realizing that the daughter he discarded possessed the exact analytical rigor he claimed she lacked. It was a silent, calculated strike. Winning the state fair triggered an automatic review by collegiate academic scouts. 2 weeks later, a thick, heavy envelope arrived in Bea's mailbox, bearing the crest of the California Institute of Technology. My hands shook as I tore it open. The acceptance letter offered me a spot in their elite molecular biology program, along with a partial academic scholarship. It was the key to my entire future. The validation washed over me, followed instantly by a crushing wave of panic. The word partial hung on the page like a death sentence. Caltech tuition was astronomical. Even with the generous grant, the remaining financial gap was $80,000 a year. Esta lived on a fixed pension and grew her own vegetables to save money. I made minimum wage washing diner coffee cups. The door to my future was finally unlocked, but the toll to walk through it was a fortune I did not possess. I had the intellect to change the world, but intellect alone could not pay the rent. The victory of the science fair evaporated, leaving me staring at a mathematical impossibility. I needed an enormous amount of cash, and I needed it immediately. The California sun beat down on the pristine concrete walkways of the Caltech campus, baking the manicured lawns. Groups of wealthy undergraduates lounged under the shade of palm trees, tossing frisbees and debating quantum mechanics over iced lattes. I did not have time to sit on the grass. I had an $80,000 tuition gap to cover every single year. My partial scholarship handled the basic laboratory fees and nothing else. The financial deficit was a ticking clock, echoing in my ears every second of every day. To survive, I constructed a daily schedule that bordered on self-destruction. I worked 3 different jobs to keep my head above water. At 4 a.m, I unlocked the heavy glass doors of the main campus library. I scanned returning textbooks under flickering fluorescent lights until my eyes burned and my fingers cramped. At noon, I tutored legacy admissions students. These were teenagers who drove imported European sports cars and whined endlessly about the difficulty of baseline organic chemistry. I swallowed my pride, forced a polite smile, and deposited their cash. By 8 at night, I scrubbed glassware in the lower-level biology labs, inhaling the sharp, stinging scent of bleach and sterile alcohol until midnight. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. My body ran on cheap dining hall coffee and raw adrenaline. On a Tuesday night in late November, during my junior year, my physical limits finally snapped. I collapsed onto a rigid vinyl cot tucked into the corner of the basement storage room. My muscles ached with a dull, relentless throb. My dinner consisted of a dusty bag of stale pretzels I bought from a malfunctioning vending machine in the hallway. The salt burned my chapped lips. The pretzels tasted like cardboard. I pulled out my phone, letting the harsh blue light illuminate the dark, windowless room. I opened Instagram. The algorithmic feed served me a picture of my family instantly. There was my older sister Chloe standing in the sunlit brick driveway of our Connecticut estate. She wore a designer white dress celebrating her recent business school graduation. Next to her sat a brand new silver Porsche tied with an oversized velvet bow. My mother, Patricia, leaned against the gleaming fender wearing dark sunglasses and a proud smile. My father, Richard, stood tall beside them, holding a crystal glass of champagne. The caption read, "So proud of our perfect girl, off to conquer the corporate world." I stared at the glowing screen. I listened to the low mechanical hum of the basement refrigerator storing biological samples. I looked down at the expired pretzel in my shaking hand. My parents purchased a luxury vehicle for the daughter who followed their exact instructions. They starved the daughter who dared to challenge their authority. I locked my phone screen, plunging the room back into darkness. I did not cry. Tears required hydration and energy I simply did not possess. I stood up from the vinyl cot, smoothed the wrinkles out of my faded scrub top, and walked back to the laboratory bench. I used their neglect as a raw fuel source. 4 years of a covert, brutal grind culminated on a sweltering June afternoon in Pasadena. The graduation commencement stage spanned the entire length of the athletic field. I wore a heavy black gown and a gold stole denoting my top-tier academic rank. I graduated summa cum laude in molecular biology, finishing at the very top of my class. When the university dean called my name, I walked across the stage and accepted the leather-bound diploma. I looked out into the massive stadium. 4,000 people filled the aluminum bleachers. Fathers held up expensive cameras recording every second. Mothers waved colorful handmade signs. Grandparents wiped away proud tears and cheered for their descendants. I scanned the folding chairs looking for a familiar face. I searched the stands. 0 blood relatives came to watch me cross the finish line. The seats I had mentally designated for the Sarah family remained entirely empty. My parents did not send a congratulatory card. They did not send a brief email. They continued their silent punishment, preferring to pretend I simply ceased to exist. But the true heartbreak of that scorching afternoon had nothing to do with Richard or Patricia. The only person I actually wanted in that stadium audience was trapped 3,000 miles away. Aunt Bee was supposed to sit in the front row. We bought her plane tickets 6 months in advance. But 3 weeks before graduation, she suffered a terrible fall in her Ithaca kitchen. The doctors rushed her to the emergency room to treat a fractured wrist. They ran routine scans to check for concussions and discovered a reality far worse than a broken bone. I sat alone on a concrete bench behind the stadium after the ceremony ended. I held my phone up to my face watching a blurry live stream video call. Bee lay in a sterile hospital bed, her silver hair spread across a thin white pillow. The brilliant eccentric botanist who taught me how to extract DNA at her kitchen table looked hollow. Her eyes darted around the hospital room, searching for a focal point. "You look beautiful, Rowena," she whispered, her voice fragile and thin. "I am so sorry I missed your big day. I just kept forgetting where I placed the airline ticket." She did not just forget the ticket. The examining neurologists diagnosed her with early-onset Alzheimer's disease. The amyloid plaques and tau tangles were already ravaging the frontal lobe of her brain, destroying her cognitive pathways. The woman who saved my life was slowly losing her own mind. I pressed my hand against the phone screen, trying to reach through the digital void. "I am going to fix this, Bee," I told her, my voice cracking. "I promise you, I will find a way." That diagnosis shifted the entire trajectory of my existence. A week after graduation, my inbox flooded with lucrative corporate job offers. Giant pharmaceutical companies, rival firms desperate to compete with my father's apex empire, offered me pristine corner offices and 6-figure signing bonuses. They wanted my brain to formulate profitable, anti-aging skin creams and minor pain relievers. I printed the glossy offer letters and fed every single one of them into a paper shredder. I chose the hardest path available. I accepted a grueling, underfunded postdoctoral research position at an independent laboratory in Boston. The facility studied extreme neurodegeneration. We lacked proper funding. Our imaging equipment was a decade old. We applied for government grants that paid mere pennies compared to the bloated corporate budgets my father controlled. But we had the intellectual freedom to target Alzheimer's disease without answering to greedy shareholders. I dedicated every waking hour to studying the specific proteins destroying my aunt's memory. I plunged into the darkness of independent academic research. Time dissolved into an endless blur of clinical trials, failed hypotheses, and breakthrough microscopic discoveries. I aged from 22 to 26 inside the cinder block walls of that Boston laboratory. My world narrowed to a microscope lens and a data notebook. I built a formidable reputation in the academic sector, publishing peer-reviewed papers that shook the scientific community. Yet I remained entirely invisible to the high society circles my family dominated. Until a crisp Tuesday morning in October. I walked into the cramped apartment I rented near the university campus. I unlocked the dented metal mailbox in the lobby and pulled out a stack of past-due utility bills. Buried beneath the mundane, windowed envelopes sat a heavy, square package. The paper was thick, premium cream-colored cardstock. It felt like holding a solid sheet of ivory. Brilliant gold foil lined the sharp edges. The return address, printed on the back flap, read Greenwich, Connecticut. My pulse spiked. I had not received a piece of physical mail from my family in 11 years. I slid my thumb under the crimson wax seal and cracked it open. It was a formal wedding invitation. Chloe. Sarah requested the honor of my presence at her marriage to Julian Sterling at the Boston Harbor Hotel. I stared at the embossed cursive letters. Chloe was getting married to a prominent old money venture capitalist. The upcoming event promised to be the social highlight of the season. Hundreds of wealthy investors, corporate elites, and powerful politicians would attend. And suddenly, after a decade of pretending I was dead, my family needed me to exist again. They did not want me there to celebrate sisterly love. They wanted me there as a theatrical prop. A high-profile society wedding required the illusion of a perfect, unified family. If the sister of the bride failed to appear, the country club gossips would start asking uncomfortable questions about Richard Sarah's parenting failures. They needed the exiled daughter to wear a modest pastel dress, smile for the society photographers, and stand quietly in the background, validating their flawless public image. I ran my fingers over the gold foil lettering. They thought I was still the terrified 15-year-old girl they discarded in the night. They assumed I would jump at the chance to rejoin their glittering, wealthy world. They had no idea I spent the last 11 years forging myself into a lethal corporate weapon. I walked upstairs to my apartment, grabbed a black pen, and checked the box marked attending. I decided it was time to show the Sarah family exactly what kind of guests they invited back into their lives. The Boston Harbor Hotel ballroom dripped with an aggressive display of wealth. Thousands of white orchids spilled over crystal vases reflecting the golden light of enormous chandeliers. A live string quartet played classical music over the quiet hum of polite high society chatter. I stood near the grand entrance, wearing a simple, dark navy dress I purchased off a clearance rack. I watched the elite crowd mingle. These were politicians, corporate titans, and venture capitalists. They wore custom-tailored tuxedos and designer gowns that cost more than my entire annual laboratory budget. This was the royal coronation of my older sister, Chloe. She walked around the room holding a flute of imported champagne glowing in a custom silk gown. Beside her stood Julian. He was her new husband and the exact type of man my father respected. Julian came from generations of old money. He worked as a partner at a ruthless venture capital firm moving billions of dollars across ledgers without ever creating a single tangible product. He possessed a sharp, arrogant jawline and a smile that looked calculated for maximum financial gain. He and Chloe were a matching set of pristine corporate assets. I checked the seating chart displayed on an ornate golden easel. The names of the most important guests populated the tables near the bridal party. Richard Sarah ensured his top pharmaceutical executives and wealthiest investors enjoyed prime views of the dance floor. I scanned the list, running my finger down the heavy parchment paper until I found my name. Rowena Sarah, table 34. I navigated through the labyrinth of circular tables, moving further and further away from the center of the room. The floral arrangements grew slightly smaller. The lighting grew slightly dimmer. Table 34 sat in the absolute darkest corner of the massive ballroom, directly next to the swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. I took my assigned seat. Every 2 minutes, a waiter kicked the heavy wooden doors open, carrying massive trays of roasted tenderloin and scorched vegetables. Each time the doors swung wide, a brutal wave of heat from the industrial ovens blasted against my bare shoulders. The smell of expensive perfume faded, replaced by the overwhelming scent of dish soap and charred meat. The constant clattering of porcelain plates and shouting chefs drowned out the elegant string quartet. My parents literally seated me next to the garbage clearing station. It was a stark, physical manifestation of my place in their world. I was an obligation they needed to hide. I sat alone, listening to the cacophony of the kitchen, sipping a glass of warm tap water. I did not complain. I did not shed a tear. I survived 12-hour shifts in a windowless biology basement, so a drafty corner of a luxury hotel could not break me. Halfway through the evening, the reception hit a lull. Guests began wandering between tables. I saw my father approaching. Richard Sarah was no longer just a vice president. He recently secured the position of Chief Executive Officer at Apex Pharmaceuticals. He walked with the terrifying confidence of a man who owned the entire room. 3 wealthy older men followed closely behind him, holding their expensive scotch glasses. They were board members for a competing biotech firm, and my father was clearly establishing his dominance. Richard stopped in front of table 34. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not offer a paternal hug. He looked at my simple navy dress, and his jaw tightened in a brief micro-expression of disgust before he forced a wide politician smile. "Gentlemen," my father said, turning to the 3 wealthy executives, "I believe you have already met my brilliant eldest daughter, Chloe, the star of the evening. And this here is my youngest, Rowena." The 3 men looked down at me with polite, mild curiosity. One of them, an older gentleman with a silver mustache, offered a slight nod. "What sector of the industry are you in, Rowena?" he asked. "Do you work alongside your father at Apex?" I opened my mouth to explain my postdoctoral fellowship. I wanted to tell them about my targeted molecular research regarding neurodegenerative decay. Before a single word left my lips, Richard placed a heavy, suffocating hand on my shoulder and squeezed tight enough to bruise. "Rowena marches to the beat of her own drum." Richard interrupted, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "She plays with test tubes in a basement lab at the university. It is not exactly the Apex legacy, but we indulge her little hobbies. Everyone needs a passion project, right?" The 3 executives chuckled. It was a low, cruel sound. They looked at me the way one might look at a confused child playing dress-up. They clinked their scotch glasses together, praising my father for his deep, charitable patience regarding his eccentric poor daughter. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The urge to scream, the urge to slap the crystal glass right out of his perfectly manicured hand surged through my veins. I wanted to announce that my little hobby was on the verge of decoding a protein sequence his billion-dollar company spent a decade failing to understand. I swallowed the anger. I forced my facial muscles to remain completely neutral. I looked up at Richard and offered a terrifyingly blank smile. "Enjoy your evening, gentlemen," I said, my voice cool and flat. Richard removed his hand from my shoulder, clearly satisfied that he had successfully diminished me in front of his peers. He led the executives back toward the center of the room, leaving me alone in the heat of the kitchen exhaust. I did not retreat to the bathroom to cry. Crying was a useless biological response. I stood up, smoothed the fabric of my cheap dress, and walked straight to the massive mahogany bar at the opposite end of the ballroom. I ordered a sparkling water with lime. I leaned against the polished wood and scanned the room, taking inventory of the power dynamics. That was when I spotted him. Sitting alone at the far end of the bar, swirling a glass of dark bourbon, was Elias Thorne. I recognized his face from a prominent financial journal I read last month. Elias was a rogue independent investor. He built his wealth by funding high-risk, disruptive biotech startups that operated outside the rigid monopolies of giant corporations like Apex. He despised the old guard. He looked incredibly bored watching the wealthy guests dance. I picked up my sparkling water and glided down the length of the bar. I stopped right next to him. "You look like a man who regrets writing a wedding gift check," I said, keeping my tone conversational but sharp. Elias turned his head. His eyes were dark and calculating. He assessed my simple dress and my unbothered posture. "And you look like someone who is plotting a very quiet murder," he replied. I laughed, taking a slow sip of my water. "I am just observing the inefficiency of the room," I told him. "For instance, I noticed your firm recently passed on funding the latest synthetic tau inhibitor proposed by the Vanguard Group. It was a smart move. Their clinical trials ignored the secondary cellular degradation caused by prolonged exposure to the stabilizing agent. Their compound will fail FDA approval within 3 years. Elias stopped swirling his bourbon. The boredom vanished from his face, replaced by sudden, intense focus. The Vanguard data was highly classified. The flaws in their chemical stabilizing agent were known only to top-tier molecular specialists. "Who exactly are you?" he asked, sitting up straight. I placed my glass on a cardboard coaster. "My name is Dr. Rowena Sarah. I run an independent research laboratory focusing on Alzheimer's disease. I am currently synthesizing a protein sequence that degrades amyloid plaques without triggering toxic brain swelling. My models are rendering flawless results, and I am entirely unencumbered by corporate oversight." I did not beg for his money. I did not ask for a favor. I presented him with a raw, undisputed mathematical advantage. I spoke to him in the only language men like Elias Thorne truly respected. I spoke in leverage. Elias stared at me for a long, silent moment. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and retrieved a matte black business card. He slid it across the polished mahogany bar. "Call my office on Tuesday, Dr. Sarah," he said. "We will schedule a private presentation. If your data matches your confidence, we might have a very lucrative conversation." I took the black card and slipped it into my small clutch purse. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. Have a wonderful evening." I did not stay for the ceremonial cutting of the 5-tier wedding cake. I did not stay to watch Chloe and Julian perform their choreographed first dance. I walked out of the Boston Harbor Hotel and stepped into the crisp, freezing midnight air. The valets rushed past me, fetching expensive sports cars for departing guests. I hailed a yellow taxi and climbed into the cracked leather back seat. As the cab drove away from the glittering harbor, I realized a fundamental truth. I could discover the cure for every disease on the planet, and my family would still view me as a failure because I refused to obey them. I stopped wanting their respect. I only wanted results. The next morning, I sat in my cramped apartment drinking black coffee before heading to my laboratory. My cell phone vibrated against the cheap laminate kitchen table. The screen illuminated, displaying a new text message. It was from Richard. I opened the notification expecting a standard post-wedding platitude. The message contained exactly 2 sentences. "Try to look more presentable next time. You are embarrassing, Chloe." I read the words twice. I did not type a defensive response. I did not demand an apology. I simply locked the screen, placed the phone face down on the table, and picked up my research notebook. Let them worry about the fabric of my dress. I had a world-changing protein to stabilize and a corporate empire to quietly destroy. 5 years evaporated inside the concrete walls of my Boston laboratory. I was 31 years old, and my universe consisted of glass pipettes, sterile gloves, and data spreadsheets. The seed funding I secured from Elias Thorne kept the fluorescent lights buzzing, but we stretched every single dollar to the breaking point. We bought refurbished centrifuges. We calibrated outdated microscopes. We did not have the pristine marble lobbies or the limitless corporate credit cards of Apex Pharmaceuticals. We had something far more dangerous. We had desperation and unhindered intellectual freedom. The cost of that freedom was isolation. 6 months ago, the only person who ever truly believed in my potential took her final breath. Aunt Bee passed away in a quiet hospice facility in upstate New York. The disease finally consumed the brilliant botanical mind that once taught me how to extract cellular material at a kitchen table. I arranged a very small memorial service. My parents did not attend. They did not send flowers. Richard and Patricia erased Bee in death just as thoroughly as they erased her in life. Before she died, Bee instructed her attorney to deliver a specific item to my apartment. It was a small, heavy mahogany box featuring a solid brass lock. The lawyer handed it to me, along with a sealed envelope containing strict instructions. I was not allowed to open the wooden container yet. The letter explicitly stated I must wait for a specific catalyst before turning the key. I placed the mahogany box on the highest shelf in my bedroom closet. I let the cold, smooth wood serve as a silent reminder of the clock ticking against my research. Bee ran out of time. I refused to let anyone else suffer the same dark cognitive decline. I channeled my grief into a relentless, grueling schedule. The laboratory became my only sanctuary. On a rainy Thursday morning at 3:14, the facility was empty. The storm outside battered the reinforced glass windows. Inside, the only sound was the low, steady hum of the climate control system and the rhythmic spinning of a cooling fan. I sat hunched over my primary workstation, rubbing my burning eyes. I wore a stained white coat over a faded gray sweater. A cold cup of black coffee sat ignored next to my keyboard. Then the sound pierced the quiet room. It was a digital 3-note chime echoing from the mass spectrometer in the corner. The tone signaled the completion of a 96-hour tissue degradation sequence. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was the final, uncompromised test of protein RS7. I spent the last 3 years isolating this specific molecular sequence, trying to engineer a compound that could navigate the blood-brain barrier without triggering an immune system revolt. I pushed my rolling chair across the linoleum floor. I clicked the mouse to awaken the high-resolution monitor. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh blue glow across my exhausted face. Row after row of numerical data cascaded down the display. I pulled up the comparative imaging files. On the left side of the screen, the baseline human neural tissue model displayed thick, dark clusters of amyloid beta plaques. These were the microscopic tangles that suffocated neurons and destroyed memories. This was the enemy. On the right side of the screen sat the exact same tissue sample after 96 hours of exposure to protein RS7. I stopped breathing. The dark clusters were gone. The protein did not merely pause the spread of the disease. It actively bound to the toxic plaques and dismantled them at a molecular level. The neural pathways were clean. The tissue remained viable and healthy. But plaque degradation was only half the battle. The true hurdle, the barrier that tripped up every major pharmaceutical giant, including Apex, was the side effect profile. Every current market drug that attempted to clear these plaques caused severe neuroinflammation. They triggered dangerous fluid buildup in the brain. The cure often proved more lethal than the cognitive decay itself. I frantically opened the secondary toxicity report. I scrolled past the metabolic panels and the cellular stress markers. I reached the inflammation index. The indicator line sat perfectly flat, 0%. The brain swelling markers were non-existent. The fluid retention data registered at baseline levels. Protein RS7 cleared the deadly plaques while leaving the surrounding healthy tissue undisturbed. I placed both hands flat on the cold laboratory counter. The magnitude of the numbers on the screen settled over my shoulders like a heavy winter coat. This was not a minor scientific increment. This was a paradigm shift. It was a monumental, world-altering discovery. I had just formulated the first viable, non-toxic treatment for neurodegenerative decay. I stared at the clean neural pathways and whispered a quiet thank you to the empty room. I did it for B. The adrenaline erased my exhaustion. I spent the next 14 hours locking down the data. I encrypted the visual models. I uploaded the final statistical proofs to 3 separate, secure offline servers. By Friday afternoon, I sat in the polished downtown office of my intellectual property attorney. We filed the preliminary provisional patent, securing my sole ownership of the chemical structure and the synthesis process. I walked out of the law firm feeling a strange sense of invincible calm. I planned to spend the next 2 weeks quietly preparing my manuscript for a major, peer-reviewed medical journal. I wanted to control the narrative. I wanted to ensure the science stood unchallenged before the corporate sharks started circling the waters. The industry did not wait 2 weeks. The industry did not even wait 2 days. Within 48 hours, the calm shattered. On Sunday evening, a minor digital biotech journal based out of Cambridge published a blind item. The headline read, "Independent Rogue Laboratory Achieves Groundbreaking Plaque Degradation Without Edema." The article did not mention my name. It did not list the specific protein identifier, but it detailed the exact 0% inflammation markers and the 96-hour clearance rate I documented in my private servers. Someone inside the patent office or someone connected to the peer review initial screening leaked the raw numbers. They recognized the explosive financial value of the data and whispered it to a journalist. Big Pharma relies on endless symptom management. Curing a disease eliminates a lifelong customer base. A treatment that permanently clears neural decay without side effects threatens to decimate billions of dollars in projected revenue across the entire medical sector. The article set the financial and scientific communities on fire. The anonymous tip acted like blood in the water. On Monday morning, the chaos arrived. I walked into my laboratory and found my 2 junior technicians staring wide-eyed at the main switchboard. The phone lines blinked with a relentless, frantic rhythm. Every single line was active. We received calls from venture capitalists offering blank checks. We received emails from elite universities suddenly eager to offer me tenured chair positions. Science reporters from major cable networks left breathless voicemails demanding exclusive interviews. The barrier holding back the outside world had collapsed. I stood in the center of the sterile room watching the red lights on the phone console flash. I instructed my staff to ignore every single inquiry. We were not answering questions. We were not confirming the Cambridge article. I needed time to fortify my legal standing before I stepped onto the public stage. I walked into my private glass-walled office and shut the heavy door, blocking out the ringing phones. I sat down at my desk and opened my encrypted laptop to check the raw data once more. I needed to focus on the science. I needed to ignore the noise. Then my personal cell phone vibrated against the metal desk. I kept this specific number private. Only my landlord, my attorney, and Elias Thorne possessed these digits. I assumed Elias was calling to discuss the leaked article and strategize our next financial move. I reached across the desk and picked up the device. I looked at the bright digital screen to accept the call. My thumb hovered over the glass. It was not Elias Thorne. It was not my lawyer. The caller identification displayed an unsaved 10-digit number, but the automated network registry pulled the corporate location routing data directly onto my screen. The glowing white text read, Apex Pharmaceuticals Executive Suite. The wolves had caught the scent. I stared at the glowing caller identification screen until the backlight timed out and went black. 11 years of silence. 11 years of holidays spent alone, birthdays unacknowledged, and graduation stadiums empty. The moment I held an asset worth billions of dollars, my father suddenly remembered my 10-digit phone number. I did not answer the call. I let it ring until the automated voicemail system engaged. Let Richard Sarah wait. 3 days later, the waiting ended. It was 7 o'clock on a Wednesday evening. The autumn air in Boston felt sharp, carrying the scent of impending winter. I stood outside my apartment building, pulling my keys from my coat pocket, when a sleek black Mercedes sedan pulled up to the curb. The tinted passenger window slid down with a quiet electric purr. Patricia Sarah looked exactly the same as she did when I was 15. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled. Her makeup was flawless. She wore a camel-colored cashmere coat and a practiced smile. Beside her in the driver's seat sat Richard, projecting the aura of a benevolent patriarch rather than a ruthless corporate titan. "Rowena, sweetheart," my mother called out, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "Get in. We are taking you to dinner." I froze on the concrete sidewalk. The audacity of the gesture was staggering. They did not call ahead. They did not ask if I had plans. They simply drove 3 hours from Connecticut, assuming their physical presence commanded my immediate compliance. Part of me wanted to turn around, walk into my building, and lock the door. But a larger, colder part of me wanted to see exactly how they planned to execute this ambush. I opened the heavy car door and slid into the leather back seat. The interior smelled like expensive leather and subtle cologne. We drove to Oya, an exclusive high-end sushi restaurant in the Leather District, where securing a reservation required months of advance notice or a massive corporate account. The maitre d' greeted my father by name, ushering us immediately to a private table sequestered in the back corner of the softly lit dining room. The performance began the moment we sat down. Patricia reached across the polished wooden table and gently patted my hand. She had not touched me in over a decade. "We saw the article in the Cambridge Journal, Row, she said, using a childhood nickname that made my skin crawl. "We knew it was you immediately. Only our brilliant girl could pull off something so extraordinary. Your father and I have been talking nonstop. We are just bursting with pride." I slowly withdrew my hand from her grasp. "You are proud of the science?" I asked, keeping my tone entirely neutral. "Or are you proud of the projected market valuation?" Richard chuckled, leaning back in his chair. He signaled the sommelier, ordering a bottle of wine that cost more than a month's rent for my laboratory space. He looked at me with an expression of deep, manufactured, paternal affection. "Both, Rowena," he said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "We are businessmen and scientists. We understand the magnitude of what you have achieved here. We also understand the extreme danger you are currently in. You are swimming in shark-infested waters right now. Independent investors, venture capitalists, rival firms, they will try to steal this from you. They will bury you in litigation. They will drown you in procedural delays until your patent expires." He was weaponizing my isolation against me. He assumed because I built this alone, I was terrified of the corporate machine. He did not realize I spent the last 11 years studying the exact schematics of his empire. "That is why we are here," Richard continued, leaning forward and lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Apex Pharmaceuticals is not just a company. It is a family legacy. It is a fortress. We want to bring you home, Rowena. We want to protect your research under the Apex umbrella." He reached into his tailored suit jacket and produced a thick stack of pristine white paper bound by a heavy black clip. He slid the document across the table. It landed next to my empty water glass with a soft thud. 50 pages of dense legal text. "Consider this an angel investment," Richard said, smiling warmly. "An internal family acquisition. We will fully fund the next 3 phases of your clinical trials. We will provide state-of-the-art laboratory space in our Greenwich headquarters. You will never have to worry about broken centrifuges or grant proposals again. We just want to keep the legacy in the family." I looked down at the document. The cover page read, "Strategic Partnership and Funding Agreement." To an exhausted, underfunded scientist, it looked like salvation. It looked like the ultimate validation from a father who finally recognized his daughter's worth. But I did not read contracts like an exhausted scientist. I read contracts like an architect, examining a structural blueprint, looking for the fatal hidden stress points. My grandmother taught me how to scan legal documents when I was 12 years old, sitting in her apartment. I did not read word by word. I read by systemic flow. I picked up the heavy document. I ignored the first 30 pages. Those sections contained standard non-disclosure clauses and flowery language detailing corporate synergy. I flipped directly to the back of the packet, specifically targeting the intellectual property assignment provisions. I ran my finger down page 42, stopping at subsection 8.4. There it was, the trap hidden in plain sight. The clause mandated that upon signing, all current and future iterations of protein RS7 would irrevocably transfer to Apex Pharmaceuticals, LLC. The funding was contingent upon granting Apex 80% ownership equity. But the true poison pill lay buried 3 paragraphs down in a subclause regarding commercialization strategy. The document explicitly granted Apex the unilateral right to determine the production timeline, indefinitely shelving the research if they deemed it competitive with existing market assets. Richard did not want to fund my cure. He wanted to buy it and lock it in a dark vault so it could never compete with his toxic flagship drug. He was offering to pay me a fraction of its worth to assassinate my life's work. I slowly closed the file. I aligned the edges perfectly with the edge of the table. I looked up at my parents. They sat in expectant silence, waiting for me to pull out a pen and surrender my future. "I cannot sign this," I said, my voice steady and cold. "The intellectual property assignment grants Apex unilateral shelving rights. You want to kill the protein, Richard. You want to buy it so it never reaches the clinical market. The paternal smile vanished from my father's face. The transformation was instantaneous. The benevolent patriarch disappeared, replaced entirely by the ruthless corporate executive. His eyes hardened, turning flat and predatory. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her chair, looking around the private dining room. "Rowena, please do not be difficult," she whispered. "Your father is offering you the world." "My father is offering me a muzzle," I replied, keeping my gaze locked on him. "I built this protein to save lives. I built it for B. I am not selling it to a company that profits from prolonged symptom management. The patent stays with me." Richard leaned across the table. His massive hands gripped the edge of the wood, his knuckles turning white. He dropped the act entirely. His voice fell to a dangerous, guttural whisper that barely carried over the soft classical music playing in the background. "You do not know how this game is played, little girl," he hissed. "You think because you manipulated a few molecules in a dirty basement that you are ready to sit at the adults' table? I own this industry. I own the regulatory boards. I own the distribution channels. You are an isolated amateur holding a ticking time bomb. I am holding a cure." I shot back, refusing to break eye contact. "And you are terrified, because it makes your entire product line obsolete. If you walk away from this table, Rowena, I swear to you, I will crush that laboratory." He snarled, his face reddening. "I will bury you in so much litigation you will never see the inside of a clean room again. I will make sure no legitimate investor touches your patent. You will lose everything." I listened to his threat. I felt the pure venom radiating from across the table. 11 years ago, that tone would have reduced me to a shaking, terrified teenager packing a duffel bag in the middle of the night. But I was no longer a 15-year-old girl begging for a chemistry waiver. I was a 31-year-old scientist holding the keys to the future of neurology. I stood up from the table. I picked up my coat and draped it over my arm. I looked down at the man who prioritized his stock options over his own daughter's intellect. "I look forward to seeing how you handle the math, Richard," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy tension of the room. "Enjoy the sushi." I turned around and walked out of the private dining room. I did not look back. I left the 50-page contract sitting untouched next to his wine glass. I left them sitting in silent, furious shock, leaving them with the astronomical dinner bill. I stepped out of the expensive restaurant and into the cold Boston night. The battle lines were officially drawn. Richard Sarah declared war against his own blood. But a frontal assault was not the only tactic in the Apex playbook. If my father could not buy my research legally, he would find a different way to take it. The Trojan horse failed to breach the gates. I knew he would send a spy next. 2 weeks passed since the disastrous dinner in the Leather District. I returned to my laboratory schedule, burying myself in the upcoming clinical trial preparations. I operated under the naive assumption that my father would respect my boundaries after our confrontation. I assumed the silence radiating from Connecticut meant Apex Pharmaceuticals was retreating to calculate a different market strategy. I failed to account for the depth of their moral bankruptcy. Richard Sarah realized he could not intimidate me across a restaurant table. He needed a different angle of attack. He needed a weapon that could bypass my defenses entirely. That weapon arrived on a Tuesday night at 11 o'clock. A torrential rainstorm battered the Boston coastline, driving the temperature down near freezing. I was sitting on my living room sofa reviewing a stack of peer-reviewed journals when the heavy brass buzzer of my apartment intercom shattered the quiet. I walked to the entry panel and pressed the speaker button. I asked who was there. A ragged, trembling voice echoed through the static of the speaker. It was Chloe. I rushed down the 3 flights of stairs and threw open the heavy glass lobby door. My older sister stood on the concrete stoop, soaked to the bone. The golden child of the Sarah family looked entirely broken. She wore a thin silk blouse clinging to her shivering shoulders, and a pair of expensive slacks stained with dark street mud. She did not have a coat. She did not have an umbrella. Her pristine blonde hair hung in wet, tangled strands across her face, and dark streaks of ruined mascara stained her cheeks. I pulled her inside the warm lobby. She collapsed against my shoulder, sobbing violently. Between ragged gasps for air, she painted a horrifying picture. She claimed her new husband, Julian, was a monster behind closed doors. She said the venture capitalist possessed a terrifying temper, restricting her finances, monitoring her phone calls, and isolating her from her friends. She told me they had a screaming match that escalated into throwing glass vases against the wall. She claimed she ran out the front door with nothing but her cell phone and the clothes on her back. She begged me for a place to sleep, saying she was too ashamed to call our parents. I am a scientist. My entire worldview is governed by empirical evidence, logic, and strict observation. But the shivering woman clutching my sweater was my sister. Blood overrides logic. The protective instincts I buried 11 years ago roared back to life. I wrapped my arms around her and guided her up the stairs into my apartment. I gave her a warm shower, a pair of dry sweatpants, and a mug of hot chamomile tea. I set up the guest bedroom with clean sheets and extra blankets. We sat on the edge of the mattress, and I listened to her cry for another hour. I felt a profound sense of tragic irony. The family that threw me away was toxic to the core, and now that same toxicity had poisoned their favorite daughter. I promised Chloe she was safe. I told her Julian would never set foot in my building. I turned off the lamp, shut the guest room door, and went to my own bedroom feeling a strange, bittersweet warmth. I finally had a sister. I fell asleep fast, exhausted by the emotional toll of the evening, but my mind was conditioned by years of working in hypervigilant environments. Deciphering microscopic data anomalies trains the brain to recognize patterns and, more importantly, to recognize when a pattern breaks. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the pattern broke. I woke up staring at the dark ceiling. The apartment was dead silent. I held my breath, listening for whatever auditory trigger pulled me out of my deep sleep. There it was. It was faint but unmistakable in the quiet night. A sharp, synthetic mechanical sound. Click. It was the digital shutter sound of a smartphone camera. I slid out of bed, placing my bare feet silently onto the cold hardwood floor. I crept down the dark hallway, holding my breath. The sound originated from my home office space, located at the far end of the living room. I used that designated corner to map out the unpatented synthesis protocols, bridging the gap between my raw protein and the human trial delivery mechanism. The walls of that alcove were lined with large, dry erase whiteboards covered in highly sensitive molecular mapping. On my heavy oak desk sat my encrypted laptop and a physical external hard drive containing the raw back-end data of my life's work. I peered around the edge of the drywall. The glow of a digital screen illuminated the dark alcove. Chloe stood in the center of the room. She was not shivering. She was not crying. Her posture was perfectly straight, exhibiting the elegant, practiced poise of a pageant winner. She held her smartphone high, panning the lens slowly across the whiteboards, capturing every single proprietary equation I had written in blue marker. I watched in frozen horror as she lowered the phone and moved toward my desk. She pulled a sleek silver thumb drive from the pocket of my borrowed sweatpants. She reached behind my primary monitor, locating the external hard drive I used for physical backups. She plugged her device into the transfer port. A small green LED light began pulsing rapidly, indicating a massive data clone was currently in progress. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice echoing loudly in the dark apartment. Chloe flinched, but she did not scream. She did not drop the phone. She turned around slowly, facing me in the dim glow of the computer monitor. The transition was terrifying to witness. The traumatized, weeping victim evaporated into thin air. Her facial muscles relaxed. Her eyes went cold and calculating. She wiped a stray smudge of fake tears from her cheek and offered me a flat, emotionless stare. "Julian is not abusive," I stated, putting the pieces together as my heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "You never had a fight." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "Julie is currently sleeping soundly in our penthouse," Chloe replied, crossing her arms. "He sends his regards, by the way. His venture capital firm is very interested in the back-end delivery mechanism you forgot to include in your preliminary patent filing." The betrayal anchored my feet to the floor. The chill in the room had nothing to do with the winter rain outside. My own sister used the concept of domestic abuse as a theatrical prop to bypass my security. She weaponized my empathy. "You are a corporate spy." I whispered the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. "Richard sent you." "Do not act so dramatic, Rowena," she scoffed, stepping away from the desk. "Dad knew you would never let him or his lawyers through your front door. But he also knew you always had a pathetic soft spot for family. You always wanted to belong. We just gave you an opportunity to play the hero." I stepped fully into the room, reaching out and ripping the silver thumb drive from the port. The green light died. I gripped the small piece of metal so hard it cut into my palm. "You are stealing my life's work, Chloe. I spent 11 years bleeding in basements to build this while you were attending country club galas." Chloe took a step forward, closing the distance between us. The mask of the golden child fell away, revealing the deeply ingrained entitlement our parents spent 2 decades cultivating within her. "Dad was right," she snarled, her voice dropping to a vicious octave. "You are just a bitter nerd who got lucky. You broke every rule this family established. You embarrassed us. You walked away. You do not get to come back a decade later holding a $1 billion lottery ticket and act like you are better than us. We played by the rules, Rowena. I did everything they asked. We deserve this money more than you do." I stared at the woman standing in my home. She was a stranger. She was an empty vessel, filled with nothing but Richard Sarah's greed and Patricia Sarah's vanity. There was no sister to save. There was only an enemy combatant standing in my territory. "Get out," I commanded, pointing toward the front door. Chloe snatched her designer coat from the back of the sofa. She slipped her smartphone into her pocket, offering me a final triumphant smirk. "Keep the thumb drive," she mocked, walking toward the exit. "It does not matter anyway. The high-resolution photos of your whiteboards already synced to my secure cloud server. Dad has everything he needs to reverse engineer your delivery mechanism. See you in court, sweetie." The heavy front door slammed shut behind her, leaving me standing alone in the deafening silence of my apartment. I looked over at the whiteboards, the blue marker equations with the missing puzzle pieces to the entire clinical trial. By capturing those formulas, Chloe handed Apex Pharmaceuticals the exact blueprints they needed to claim overlapping intellectual property. I walked over to the window and watched my sister climb into a black town car waiting idle on the rainy street below. The trap had sprung successfully. My father now possessed enough raw scientific data to march into a federal courthouse and file a crippling injunction against my laboratory. The corporate war was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a loaded gun pointed directly at my head. I had to find a way to dodge the bullet. The morning sun glared through the wide windows of a crowded Cambridge cafe, illuminating the floating dust particles in the air. I sat tucked into a small corner booth, attempting to reconstruct the stolen formulas from memory. The caffeine coursed through my veins, but failed to erase the crushing exhaustion of my sister's betrayal. I stared at my open notebook until the blue ink lines began to blur. A man wearing a nondescript beige windbreaker stopped at the edge of my table. I assumed he wanted to ask if the opposite chair was available. Instead, he reached into his messenger bag and retrieved a dense, bound stack of legal paperwork. He dropped the heavy bundle directly onto my open notebook. A single bead of condensation rolled down the curved plastic of my iced coffee cup. It dripped off the edge, hitting the crisp, white cover page of the legal summons. The icy water blossomed into a dark, translucent stain over my printed name. "Rowena Sarah," the man said, his tone bored and practiced. "You have been served." He turned and disappeared into the morning rush hour crowd before I could even draw a breath. I reached out with trembling fingers and pulled the heavy stack of documents toward me. The bold black header text carried the official seal of the Federal District Court. The plaintiff listed on the first line was Apex Pharmaceuticals. I read the primary complaint. The legal theory presented by my father's attorneys was breathtaking in its audacity. Richard did not attempt to claim his scientists invented protein RS7. Instead, his legal team engineered a concept of familial sweat equity. They drafted a sprawling 70-page brief arguing that the Sarah Family Trust financed my foundational private school education and purchased my earliest childhood chemistry sets. They presented receipts from a microscopic lens my mother bought for my 12th birthday. Because those early financial investments theoretically nurtured my intellect, they argued, Apex Pharmaceuticals held a retroactive partial ownership over my current brain output. They claimed my biological research was an active byproduct of their initial domestic funding. The argument was a fabricated, flimsy fiction. Any competent judge possessing a shred of common sense would eventually throw the entire case out of court. But Richard understood a terrifying truth about the American judicial system. The actual verdict did not matter. The strategy was pure financial suffocation. Corporate warfare rarely relies on who holds the moral high ground. It relies on who runs out of capital first. My father deployed this frivolous lawsuit as a tactical weapon designed to starve my laboratory into submission. The true damage lay buried on page 19. The federal judge assigned to the initial filing granted a temporary injunction requested by Apex. The order mandated an immediate freeze on all commercialization and developmental efforts pending a formal evidentiary hearing. The effect rippled through my life instantaneously. I left the cafe and walked briskly to my research facility. I logged into our supplier portal to order a fresh batch of sterile reagents for our upcoming Monday tissue trials. I typed in the laboratory debit card numbers and clicked Submit. The screen flashed red. The transaction declined. I opened my commercial banking application. A stark gray banner stretched across the top of my financial dashboard. My institutional accounts held zero available credit. The funds were locked, trapped in an impenetrable legal escrow. The injunction severed my financial arteries. The steady heartbeat of my independent research stopped in a single morning. I stepped into the quiet hallway and dialed Elias Thorne. The rogue investor answered on the third ring. His voice lacked the quiet, calculating admiration he displayed at the Boston Harbor Hotel. He sounded tired. He sounded like a man calculating losses. "I received the legal notice an hour ago," Elias said, before I could even explain the situation. "Rowena, your clinical data is immaculate. I still believe your protein is the holy grail of neurology. But my venture firm cannot underwrite a protracted war of attrition against a behemoth like Apex." I gripped the phone tightly. "It is a baseless lawsuit," I pleaded, keeping my voice steady. "The intellectual property is entirely mine. We can defeat this in front of a judge." "You are right," he replied. "You could defeat them in 3 years." But Richard dispatched an army of corporate litigators. They will file endless motions to delay the proceedings. They will drain your resources. I cannot justify bleeding millions of dollars in legal fees to my own board of directors just to keep your doors open. I am sorry, Dr. Sarah. We are pulling our seed funding. The line went dead. Other independent backers followed suit within the hour. They sent polite, evasive emails retracting their commitments. The biotech industry respected brilliant minds, but it bowed to bottomless wallets. I was cast out into the cold once again. My final hope rested in a sleek glass office downtown. I carried the soaked legal bundle to my intellectual property attorney. He spent 40 minutes reviewing the injunction and the sweat equity claims. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed his temples. He explained that breaking the federal injunction required assembling a specialized, corporate defense team. He needed to hire external forensic accountants and senior litigators. He quoted me a minimum retainer fee of $100,000 just to file the preliminary counter motions and schedule a hearing. I sat in his expensive leather chair, feeling the last remnants of my hope evaporate. I possessed exactly $3,000 in my personal checking account. I could not afford to fight. I walked home through the biting Boston wind. The city felt gray and indifferent. I unlocked the door to my apartment and stepped inside. The space felt hollow. I walked past the kitchen and sank onto the hardwood floor of my living room. I pulled my knees to my chest, staring at the empty whiteboards in my office alcove where Chloe stole my unpatented formulas. I was entirely defeated. My father won. He stole my future without ever setting foot inside my home. He used his boundless wealth to build an insurmountable wall around my discovery, ensuring the cure for neurodegenerative decay would die in a dark corporate vault. I buried my face in my hands. The heavy silence of the apartment pressed down on my shoulders. As I sat in the gathering shadows of the late afternoon, a stray beam of sunlight pierced the window blinds. It cast a narrow golden line across the room, highlighting the top shelf of my open bedroom closet. The light reflected off a small brass lock. I lifted my head. Sitting on the top shelf collecting dust was the heavy mahogany box Aunt Bee left me before she died. The attached letter dictated I must wait for a specific catalyst before turning the key. Bee told me I would know the exact moment the universe required me to open it. Losing my life's work to the exact people who destroyed my aunt's legacy felt like the ultimate catalyst. My hands stopped trembling. I stood up from the hardwood floor and walked toward the closet. The corporate ambush paralyzed me, but Bee always taught me how to find the hidden variable. I reached up and pulled the wooden box down from the shelf, ready to see what my aunt left behind. The heavy mahogany box sat securely on my lap, pressing a comforting weight into my thighs. I traced the smooth, polished grain of the wood with my fingertips. A small brass padlock secured the front latch, keeping my aunt's final secrets sealed away from the world. I walked into my cramped kitchen and retrieved a heavy steel hammer from the utility drawer. I did not possess the combination or the original key to the external padlock, so I relied on brute force. I struck the brass fixture once. The metal fractured. I struck it a second time, and the latch gave way with a sharp metallic snap. I lifted the heavy wooden lid. A distinct fragrance drifted upward, immediately hitting my senses. It was the undeniable aroma of old parchment paper mixed with dried lavender. It smelled exactly like the upstate sanctuary where I rebuilt my life at 15. Inside the velvet-lined interior rested 3 distinct items. A single antique brass key lay next to a pristine white business card printed with crisp, black ink. Beneath them sat a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing my name in familiar cursive script. I picked up the business card first. The text read, Thomas Sterling, attorney at law, encompassing a prestigious address in the financial district. I opened the envelope next, unfolding the heavy paper with trembling fingers. My dearest Rowena, she wrote, if you are reading this, it means your father finally realized exactly how brilliant you are. Richard spent his entire life taking credit for the labor of others. I watched him devour competitors for 3 decades. I always knew the moment you synthesize something world-changing, he would attempt to steal it. He operates on greed, but he relies on intimidation. He expects you to fight him as an isolated, exhausted scientist. He expects you to fold. I swallowed hard, feeling a tight knot form in my throat. Bee understood my father better than anyone else on earth. She witnessed the exact same corporate cruelty I was currently enduring. But you are not fighting alone, Rowena, the letter continued. You never were. I spent the last few years of my life building a fortress around your intellect. I knew my memory was failing, but my legal foresight remained perfectly intact. Take the brass key and the business card to Thomas Sterling. He is expecting you. It is time to show your father what happens when a scientist engineers a flawless trap. I pressed the letter against my chest, letting a single tear fall. The grief washed away, replaced by a sudden, surging current of cold adrenaline. The corporate ambush paralyzed me yesterday. Today, the proxy armed me for war. The next morning, I walked through the heavy wooden doors of a discreet law firm located on State Street. The office did not feature the flashy glass walls or the modern art installations favored by giant corporate practices like the ones Apex employed. The reception area showcased dark oak paneling, antique oil paintings, and the quiet, steady ticking of a grandfather clock. It radiated old money and quiet, undisputed power. A receptionist led me down a long corridor into a spacious corner office overlooking the harbor. Thomas Sterling stood behind a massive walnut desk. He was a sharp older gentleman wearing a tailored navy suit and wire-rimmed glasses. He projected an aura of absolute meticulous control. He extended his hand, offering a firm, respectful greeting. "Dr. Sarah," he said, his voice steady and calm, "I have been anticipating your arrival. Beatrice spoke of your intellect with extraordinary reverence. Please take a seat. We have a considerable amount of ground to cover today." I sat in the plush leather chair and handed him the antique brass key. He accepted it with a knowing nod, unlocking a secure steel drawer built into the side of his desk. He retrieved a thick, leather-bound portfolio and placed it squarely between us. "I read the lawsuit your father filed against you yesterday," Sterling began, opening the file. "The sweat equity argument is a fascinating piece of legal fiction. Richard assumes he trapped you by freezing your personal financial assets and tying your individual identity to his corporate claims. He believes Apex Pharmaceuticals successfully paralyzed your research laboratory." I nodded, feeling the lingering anxiety tighten my chest. "The federal judge granted their temporary injunction," I explained. "They locked my commercial banking accounts. I cannot purchase reagents. I cannot run my clinical trials. I am entirely out of capital, Mr. Sterling. My independent investors pulled their funding because they are terrified of facing an army of Apex litigators." Sterling offered a slow, terrifyingly calm smile. "They froze the accounts linked to your personal Social Security number," he corrected, tapping his expensive fountain pen against the desk. "But you do not own the intellectual property for Protein RS7, Rowena. Apex is currently suing the wrong entity. The injunction is entirely unenforceable." I stared at him, unable to comprehend the statement. "I filed the provisional patents myself," I argued. "I signed the paperwork 2 weeks ago." "You signed the paperwork as the lead scientific developer," Sterling clarified, "but you did not file it under your individual name. 3 years ago, Beatrice retained my services to establish an impenetrable blind trust. We named it the BS Research Foundation. We routed all of your early laboratory leases, your equipment purchases, and your patent applications through this invisible corporate umbrella. Your father directed his $100 million legal team to assassinate Rowena Sarah. But Rowena Sarah does not legally own the cure for Alzheimer's disease. The blind trust owns it." The revelation hit me like a physical shockwave. B built a phantom shield around my entire career without me ever realizing it. She anticipated Richard's exact strategy and neutralized it years in advance. The federal injunction applied solely to my personal checking accounts. The legal freeze meant nothing. My father swung a sledgehammer at a ghost. Apex Pharmaceuticals just wasted millions of dollars initiating a lawsuit against a target that held zero legal authority over the asset they desperately wanted to steal. "But we still have to fight them in court," I said, my mind racing through the logistics. "They will discover the blind trust eventually. They will amend their filings and target the foundation. The legal fees required to sustain a corporate defense will still bankrupt me. My father possesses infinite resources. I cannot hire a defense team with good intentions alone." Sterling leaned back in his leather chair. The serene expression never left his face. He turned the leather portfolio around, sliding it across the polished walnut wood so I could read the top page. Beatrice was a brilliant botanist, Sterling said quietly, but she was also a deeply pragmatic woman. In 1984, she purchased a sprawling tract of undeveloped farmland on the outskirts of San Jose, California. She intended to build a private conservatory. She never developed the land. Over the last 4 decades, the surrounding area transformed into the epicenter of the global technology sector. That empty dirt field became one of the most valuable commercial parcels in the state. 6 months before she passed away, we quietly liquidated a small fraction of that real estate. I looked down at the financial ledger printed on the crisp white paper. The numbers printed in the bottom column seemed impossible. The trust held a dedicated legal defense fund sitting in a high-yield escrow account. I counted the zeros trailing behind the primary digit. $5 million. It was liquid capital, ready for immediate deployment. The money sat fully detached from my frozen personal accounts, entirely untouchable by my father's federal injunction. B did not just leave me a legal loophole. She left me an arsenal. You are not walking into a courtroom as a defenseless, underfunded academic, Sterling told me, closing the leather portfolio. You are walking into this battle armed with an elite legal structure and a $5 million war chest. I already drafted the counter motions to dissolve the personal injunction. We are going to humiliate the Apex legal team in front of the federal magistrate. And then, Dr. Sarah, we are going to pivot. We are going to go on the offensive. I looked out the window at the Boston Harbor. The dark storm clouds were finally breaking, allowing shards of bright sunlight to strike the water. For 11 years, I operated in the shadows, terrified of the vast corporate power my family wielded. I survived by running away. I survived by hiding my brilliance behind locked basement doors. That era ended today. Draft the paperwork I told my new attorney standing up from the leather chair. File the counter motions immediately. But do not inform Apex about the blind trust yet. Let them believe they still have me backed into a corner. Let them believe they won. Sterling raised an eyebrow, adjusting his glasses. May I ask why you want to delay the legal revelation? Because I want them to step into the light, I replied, a cold, decisive energy vibrating through my veins. My father loves controlling the narrative. He loves performing for the cameras. We are going to give him a stage. We are going to let him dig his own grave in front of the entire world. The morning of October 14th arrived with a crisp, biting chill. I stood behind the acrylic podium in the main auditorium of the University Research Center. The room was packed to maximum capacity. Science journalists, medical correspondents, and local news anchors filled every folding chair and lined the back walls. I called this press conference to officially announce the transition of protein RS7 into Phase 1 human clinical trials. But the scientific milestone was only the bait. I spent the last 72 hours working alongside Thomas Sterling, engineering a public spectacle designed to trap the most dangerous predator in the pharmaceutical sector. Richard Sarah believed he held all the cards. My father assumed the federal injunction successfully paralyzed my laboratory. He thought I exhausted my meager savings and realized the futility of fighting a $400 million conglomerate. In his mind, this press conference was my formal surrender. 10 minutes before I took the stage, the heavy double doors at the back of the auditorium swung wide open. The ambient chatter in the room dropped to a hushed murmur. Richard walked down the center aisle wearing his signature charcoal suit. He projected the confident, benevolent aura of a king inspecting his domain. Beside him walked Patricia, displaying her practiced high society smile. Trailing closely behind them came my sister Chloe and her venture capitalist husband Julian. They moved as a unified, wealthy phalanx. They ignored the assigned seating and marched directly to the front row reserved for senior faculty members. Richard unbuttoned his suit jacket and sat down, crossing his legs. He looked up at me standing behind the podium and offered a slow, patronizing nod. He thought I was about to announce an exclusive partnership with Apex Pharmaceuticals. He expected me to publicly hand over my life's work to save my career. I stepped up to the microphone. I detailed the microscopic mechanisms of the protein. I explained the 96-hour clearance rate and the 0% inflammation markers. I laid out the timeline for the upcoming clinical trials. The journalists scribbled furiously on their notepads. The atmosphere crackled with the energy of a genuine historical breakthrough. As I concluded my scientific overview, the floor opened for questions. A reporter from a prestigious medical journal raised her hand. She stood up, holding a digital recorder. "Dr. Sarah," she said, her voice amplifying through the room, "this discovery is poised to rewrite the textbook on neurodegenerative diseases. Looking back at the trajectory of your career and the sheer volume of obstacles in independent biotech, who inspired you to pursue this specific line of research?" This was the moment. The trap was fully set. Before I could utter a single syllable, movement caught my eye. Chloe stood up from her front row seat. My older sister walked up the 3 wooden steps onto the stage. She wore a tailored designer dress and a perfectly engineered expression of overwhelming sibling pride. She intended to hijack the narrative right in front of the cameras. She planned to wrap her arm around my shoulder, lean into the microphone, and announce that the Sarah family was stepping in to fully fund the remaining trials under the Apex corporate banner. She reached out her manicured hand toward the flexible neck of the microphone. The blinding pop of a camera flash illuminated the room, reflecting sharply off the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. I did not step back. I did not shrink. I moved my body horizontally, inserting myself directly between Chloe and the podium. I planted my feet and blocked her access completely. Chloe froze. Her fake smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The confusion registered in her eyes. I did not break eye contact with her as I leaned down into the microphone. Everyone who told me I could not, I answered. The room erupted into a flurry of camera shutters. The reporters sensed the immediate, visceral tension radiating from the stage. The narrative of a happy family reunion shattered instantly. Another journalist from a major financial network stood up quickly, seizing the momentum. "Dr. Sarah," he asked, pointing his pen toward the front row. "The presence of your father, Richard Sarah, CEO of Apex Pharmaceuticals, suggests a looming corporate merger. Can you confirm if Apex is acquiring the commercial rights to your protein?" I looked down at my father. Richard leaned forward in his chair. He straightened his tie, ready to stand up and accept the applause. He expected me to deliver the scripted surrender. I reached under the podium and retrieved a thick stack of manila folders. I handed the top folder to the financial journalist sitting in the front row and gestured for my laboratory assistants to distribute the rest among the press pool. "Apex Pharmaceuticals is not acquiring my research," I stated, my voice echoing loud and clear through the speakers. In fact, Apex Pharmaceuticals is currently attempting to suffocate this cure through frivolous litigation. A collective gasp rippled through the auditorium. The journalists ripped open the manila folders. Inside, they found copies of the exact legal summons my father served me at the cafe. 3 days ago, my father, Richard Sarah, filed a federal lawsuit against me. I continued speaking directly to the cameras. He is claiming that because he purchased a toy chemistry set for me when I was a child, his corporation is entitled to retroactive sweat equity regarding my current biological discoveries. He convinced a judge to issue a temporary injunction freezing all of my personal financial accounts. He did this to starve my laboratory of the funds necessary to begin human trials. He is deliberately attempting to delay a viable treatment for Alzheimer's disease, simply because he cannot control the patent. The silence in the room was absolute, replaced only by the frantic flipping of paper as the reporters read the damning legal documents. I laid out every single detail. I exposed the aggressive corporate bullying. I explained how Apex utilized unlimited wealth to crush independent scientists who refused to sign predatory intellectual property assignments. I watched my father realize his entire strategy had just detonated in his face. Richard was trapped. He sat in the front row, surrounded by dozens of active cameras and recording devices. If he shouted at me, he would look like an unhinged tyrant. If he threatened me, he would confirm every single accusation I just leveled against him. He was forced to sit in silent, agonizing humiliation while his own daughter dismantled his public image on live television. The media narrative shifted instantaneously. This was no longer a heartwarming story about a family combining forces to cure a disease. It was the ultimate Goliath narrative, where a massive conglomerate attempted to bury a brilliant, underfunded scientist. I was fighting for the good of humanity. Richard was the greedy corporate villain trying to steal a life-saving drug to protect his own market share. Chloe backed away from me slowly, her face pale and terrified. She quietly stepped off the stage and returned to her seat next to Julian. Her husband stared at the floor, looking like a man who just watched his venture capital firm walk into a public relations nightmare. "I am not surrendering my research," I announced, projecting my voice to the very back row. "I will fight this baseless injunction. Protein RS7 belongs to the public trust, and it will never be buried in an Apex Pharmaceuticals vault. Thank you all for coming." I stepped away from the podium and walked off the stage. The reporters shouted dozens of follow-up questions, begging for exclusive interviews. I ignored them, letting my legal team handle the press packets. I walked through the side exit into a quiet concrete hallway. A moment later, the heavy door slammed open. Richard stepped into the corridor, his face flushed dark red with unadulterated rage. He abandoned the calm corporate mask entirely. "You think you are clever," he hissed, his voice shaking with fury. "You think a few newspaper articles will stop me? I will have that injunction finalized by Friday. You do not have the money to fight my lawyers, Rowena. You cannot even buy sterile gloves for your laboratory right now. I will bleed you dry." He still did not know about the blind trust. He still believed he held the financial high ground. He turned around and stormed back into the auditorium to initiate damage control, leaving me standing alone in the hallway. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs. I won the public relations battle, but my father was right about one thing. He would not stop. He would realize the injunction against my personal accounts was useless soon enough. When the direct legal assault failed, he would look for a secondary target. He would stop trying to buy the research and start trying to buy the ground underneath my feet. I needed to prepare for a massive escalation. 72 hours after the press conference, my father realized he could not win the public relations war. The news cycles played my statements on an endless loop. Medical ethics boards began publishing op-eds condemning predatory pharmaceutical tactics. The temporary injunction freezing my personal checking accounts remained active, but Richard knew it was only a matter of time before a federal judge reviewed the national backlash and dissolved the order. He needed a definitive, irreversible method to stop my clinical trials before they began. If he could not starve my finances, he decided to destroy my physical footprint. My research laboratory operated out of a crumbling brick annex on the southern edge of the university campus. The building was constructed in the late 1970s, featuring outdated plumbing and drafty windows. I rented the subterranean basement level because the lease agreement was cheap. But that dark basement housed 7 specialized sub-zero freezers containing the stabilized cultures of protein RS7. The biological samples were incredibly fragile. If the power failed, or if the cultures endured a physical relocation, the delicate molecular bonds would degrade. My father bypassed the legal system entirely and pivoted to corporate bribery. He formed a strategic alliance with my brother-in-law. Julian operated as a senior partner at Crestwood Capital, managing billions in venture funds. Together, they drafted a joint proposal. Richard and Julian planned to offer the university an unprecedented $50 million philanthropic endowment. The money came with a single binding stipulation. The university must accept the funds to construct a state-of-the-art biotechnology center on the exact site of the old brick annex. The board would be forced to demolish the current structure immediately, terminating all existing tenant leases. They planned to evict me legally, wrapping the assassination of my research in the polite guise of campus modernization. They scheduled the vote for 2 o'clock on Friday. At 1:55, I walked through the towering glass doors of the University Administration Building. I took the elevator to the top floor, where the Board of Regents convened inside a sprawling, sunlit conference room. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer, mirroring the exact shade of corporate armor my father favored. I carried a sleek leather portfolio tucked under my arm. I did not knock. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped into the room. 12 distinguished university regents sat around an enormous oval walnut table. At the far end of the room, my father stood beside a digital projector presenting a glossy architectural rendering of the proposed new science center. Julian sat near the front, wearing a bespoke navy suit. He projected the effortless arrogance of a man accustomed to purchasing whatever he desired. He held a silver Mont Blanc pen, tapping it in a steady, rhythmic cadence against the polished wood of the table. Tap, tap, tap. The sound, "You are not." I believe I possess the right to address the committee before a formal vote takes place. Richard gripped the edges of the presentation podium. The benevolent, philanthropic mask he wore for the regents slipped, revealing the raw hostility simmering underneath. "Chancellor," he interjected, his voice dropping to a harsh octave, "this is an administrative real estate negotiation. My daughter is currently embroiled in an emotional public dispute with my company. She is attempting to disrupt a generous endowment simply to further her own misguided vendetta. It will. You are proposing a $50 million endowment to modernize the campus," I said, stopping directly across from my brother-in-law. "The architectural mock-ups are beautiful, but the core contingency of your offer relies on the university tearing down the southern annex to clear the construction site." Julian offered a slow nod, continuing his steady tapping. "Progress requires clearing away the obsolete structures, Rowena. It is nothing personal. It is merely business." I opened my leather portfolio. I pulled out a thick stack of documents bound with a navy blue legal ribbon. The top page featured the official embossed seal of the county clerk office. I placed the documents gently onto the walnut table, sliding them toward the chancellor. The rhythmic tapping of Julian's Mont Blanc pen abruptly stopped. The silence in the room stretched, pulling the tension taut like a piano wire. Julian stared at the paperwork. His smirk evaporated, replaced by a sudden flickering realization that the ground beneath his bespoke Italian shoes was giving way. I turned my attention to the head of the table. "Chancellor, I understand the immense pressure of securing institutional funding," I said. "But you cannot vote on the demolition of the southern annex today. The university no longer owns the property." Richard stepped away from the podium, his face drained of color. "What kind of trick is this?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the large room. "It is not a trick," Richard I replied, finally meeting his gaze. "It is a real estate transaction. 48 hours ago, a private entity known as the B.S. Research Foundation approached the University Endowment Office. They offered to purchase the deed to the Southern Annex for 3 times the current market appraisal. Because the building was classified as a distressed asset, the Endowment Office expedited the sale to secure the liquid capital. The funds cleared escrow this morning." The chancellor reviewed the top page of the deed. She looked up at my father, offering an apologetic shrug. "The paperwork is legally sound, Mr. Sarah," she confirmed. "The university officially transferred the property at 9 o'clock this morning. We cannot authorize a demolition on land we no longer possess." My father stared at me, his chest heaving with suppressed fury. He turned his glare toward Julian, blaming the venture capitalist for failing to anticipate the maneuver. Julian sat frozen, his silver pen resting motionless on the table. The brilliant corporate strategy they spent days engineering collapsed in less than 2 minutes. "Who owns this foundation?" Richard hissed, stepping toward me. "What obscure holding company did you convince to buy a crumbling brick basement?" I looked at the man who threw me out of his house when I was 15 years old. I looked at the executive who attempted to steal my life's work and bury it in a dark vault. I felt the ghost of Aunt Bee standing right beside me, anchoring my spirit. I am the sole director of the BS Research Foundation, I stated, my voice ringing with cold, undeniable authority. You tried to evict me from my own laboratory, Richard, but as of this morning, I am my own landlord. You cannot buy the building. You cannot terminate the lease. You have zero leverage left in this room. The regents sat in stunned silence. They watched a young, independent scientist outmaneuver two of the most powerful financial predators on the eastern seaboard. The $50 million endowment vanished. Now he lost the physical real estate war. He was out of options. He was out of ammunition. He stood near the projector looking like a deposed king stripped of his crown. You think you won, he spat, his voice thick with venom. You think securing a dirty basement means you can bring a drug to market? You do not have the infrastructure. You do not have the distribution network. You are holding a protein you can never sell. I reached into my leather portfolio one last time. I retrieved a secondary folder. This one was slim, containing only a few pages of high-resolution molecular imaging and a stark graph featuring a plunging red line. I did not spend the last 11 years building a product to sell, Richard, I said, pulling the pages out and placing them on the table. I built a product to heal. But you never cared about healing. You only cared about protecting your own market share. You fought so desperately to steal my research because you knew it worked better than your flagship drug. I slid the glossy, color-coded data sheet across the polished walnut wood, pushing it directly into his hands. But I did not just come here to keep my lab, Richard. I continued, the temperature in my voice dropping to freezing. I came to explain exactly what protein RS7 does. I watched the glossy, color-coded comparative data sheet glide across the polished walnut surface. It slowed to a halt directly in front of my father's hands. The thick, heavy paper featured two distinct longitudinal graphs mapping human cognitive function over a 10-year period. The 12 university regents leaned forward in their high-backed leather chairs. The atmosphere inside the top-floor conference room shifted from an administrative real estate dispute into something entirely different. They sensed the air pressure dropping. Julian sat motionless beside my father. The arrogant venture capitalist stopped breathing, staring at the vivid red and blue lines printed on the page. Richard picked up the document. His eyes darted across the statistical legends and the microscopic tissue imaging panels. For 25 years, my father built his reputation on a single pharmaceutical asset. Apex manufactured a daily oral medication formulated to suppress the early symptoms of memory loss. That specific pill generated roughly $2 billion in annual global revenue. It funded the Greenwich estate. It paid for Chloe's sports cars. It transformed my father from a mid-level laboratory manager into a ruthless industry titan. He always claimed his product offered patients the gift of time. I came to this boardroom to prove he was actually stealing it. Look closely at the control group mapping. Richard I instructed, keeping my voice dangerously calm and measured. Those neural tissue samples belonged to patients who maintained a daily regimen of your flagship therapeutic compound for more than 60 months. Richard squinted at the paper. His jaw clenched tight enough to snap a bone. These are standard degradation models he dismissed, attempting to sound bored. Alzheimer is a progressive, terminal condition, Rowena. Everyone knows the efficacy of the treatment plateaus over time. The plaque inevitably returns. You are wasting the board members' time showing us basic disease pathology. I am not showing you a natural pathology I corrected, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the head of the table. I am showing you a chemical reaction. I turned my attention to the university regents, ensuring every single person in the room understood the gravity of the data. When I began my independent postdoctoral fellowship, I relied on specific neurological tissue models donated by a patient enduring early-onset dementia. That patient was Beatrice Sarah. My aunt took the Apex medication every single morning for 5 years. When she died, I analyzed her cerebral cortex, expecting to find standard amyloid beta tangles. I paused, letting the weight of my aunt's name hang in the sterile corporate air. Instead, I found a synthetic residue, I revealed. Julian's head snapped up. His eyes widened, reflecting a sudden primal panic. As a senior partner at Crestwood Capital, he understood the devastating legal implications of the word synthetic. Your daily pill contains a proprietary chemical stabilizing agent designed to extend the shelf life of the medication, I explained, looking directly into my father's eyes. For the first 4 years of treatment, the compound operates exactly as advertised. It suppresses the neuroinflammation. It gives families false hope. But human biology is relentless. After 60 months of continuous exposure, the human liver stops metabolizing that specific stabilizing agent. The chemical crosses the blood-brain barrier and begins to pool inside the frontal lobe. Richard dropped the data sheet onto the table. His hands began to tremble. A thin sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but his vocal cords failed to produce a sound. When that synthetic residue interacts with naturally occurring tau proteins, it acts as a catastrophic biological accelerator, I stated, my voice ringing with clinical precision. It operates like pouring gasoline onto a smoldering fire. The data in front of you proves that patients taking your medication for more than 5 years experience a neural decay rate 300% faster than patients who receive zero medical intervention whatsoever. A collective gasp echoed around the oval table. The chancellor covered her mouth with a trembling hand. The reality of the numbers washed over the room, leaving a trail of pure horror. Your flagship drug does not halt the disease, Richard, I said, stepping closer to the projector. It manufactures an accelerated death. You are chemically inducing rapid cognitive collapse to secure recurring quarterly profits. That is a lie, my father finally shouted, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. He slammed both fists onto the walnut table. You fabricated this data to ruin me. Apex adheres to strict regulatory protocols. We run endless longitudinal safety panels. Your safety panels end at 48 months, I countered, anticipating his exact defense. You intentionally terminate your clinical observations right before the 5-year mark. You knew the chemical structure was unstable long-term. You deliberately designed the testing parameters to hide the toxic byproduct. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a second sheet of glossy paper. I tossed it onto the table, letting it land right on top of the first graph. I did not just discover your poison, I told him. I engineered the antidote. I pointed to the secondary graph highlighting a sharp, upward-trending blue line. I explained the exact mechanism of my discovery. Protein RS7 did not merely clear natural biological plaques. The molecular sequence I spent 11 years perfecting specifically targeted and neutralized the toxic synthetic residue created by the Apex medication. My research inadvertently required me to cure the exact chemical damage my father inflicted upon his own sister. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. Richard spent the last month deploying every weapon in his corporate arsenal to steal my patent. He orchestrated public humiliation. He sent my own sister to spy on me. He filed frivolous lawsuits and attempted to bribe a university to demolish my laboratory. He did all of this assuming my protein threatened his future market share. He never realized my protein exposed his past crimes. If Apex successfully acquired my research, they would have buried it in a dark vault forever. They would have silenced the only scientist on Earth who possessed the empirical proof of their pharmaceutical negligence. Julian pushed his chair away from the table. The wooden legs scraped harshly against the floor. The venture capitalist looked physically ill. His firm held hundreds of millions of dollars in Apex stock. They underwrote the corporate expansion. If this data reached the public sector, the ensuing class action lawsuits would bankrupt Apex Pharmaceuticals within a month. The stock price would plummet to zero. Federal investigators would raid their corporate headquarters. The liability was infinite. Rowena Julian stammered, holding up his hands in a frantic, placating gesture. Let us take a breath. let us handle this rationally. We are all family here. We can contain this. We can pull the flagship drug from the market quietly, citing supply chain issues. We can pivot the Apex manufacturing infrastructure to produce your protein instead. We will make you the majority shareholder. We will give you everything. I stared at my brother-in-law. 10 minutes ago, he sat in this exact room, tapping an expensive pen, attempting to evict me onto the street. Now he was begging me to save his investment portfolio. The cowardice was breathtaking. "This is an internal corporate matter," Richard added, his voice reducing to a desperate, breathless wheeze. He walked around the edge of the large table, approaching me with his palms facing outward. "Please, Rowena. You proved your point. You are brilliant. You won. I will withdraw the federal injunction this afternoon. I will resign as Chief Executive Officer. You can take my place. Just keep the comparative data inside this room. Give me time to restructure the clinical division." My father was a man who navigated his entire life believing wealth could erase accountability. He assumed every single person possessed a price tag. He thought he could purchase my silence by offering me the very throne he used to destroy my aunt. I looked at the 12 university regents. They sat frozen, serving as pristine, impartial witnesses to a sprawling corporate confession. Then I looked dead into my father's eyes. "I am not here to negotiate a merger, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper. "I am here to serve an eviction notice." I checked my wristwatch, noting the exact time. At 8 o'clock this morning, I sent the unredacted longitudinal data, the raw microscopic imaging files, and the complete chemical breakdown of your synthetic residue to the Director of the Food and Drug Administration. I revealed. I also sent encrypted copies to the investigative journalism desks at 3 major international news organizations. The remaining color drained from my father's face, leaving him looking like a hollow chalk statue. They're reviewing the files right now. I continued delivering the final irreversible blow. The federal subpoenas are likely already drafted. The clinical holds will trigger before the market closes today. You do not have an empire left to offer me. Apex Pharmaceuticals is a smoking crater. Richard stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the conference table. He gripped the polished wood, trying to keep his balance, as his entire reality fractured and collapsed. Decades of ruthless manipulation, boundless greed, and artificial prestige burned to ash in a matter of seconds. He lost everything. He lost his wealth. He lost his reputation. He was facing the very real, terrifying prospect of federal prison. He looked up at me. His eyes were wide, filled with a profound, devastating terror. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had nothing left to say. I picked up my empty leather portfolio and tucked it neatly under my arm. I adjusted the collar of my charcoal blazer, feeling the heavy, invisible weight of the last 11 years lift entirely off my shoulders. "Science is for boys, Richard," I said, delivering the words with surgical, lethal precision. "Let us see how you handle the math." The news broke before the stock market closed on Friday afternoon. By 3 o'clock, the financial networks interrupted their standard broadcasts. The anchor on the primary cable news channel stared into the camera, reading the breaking bulletin. The Food and Drug Administration issued an emergency clinical hold on the flagship therapeutic manufactured by Apex Pharmaceuticals. The federal agency announced an immediate structural investigation into the long-term neural degradation caused by the proprietary stabilizing agent. The ticker symbol for Apex began to plummet. It started as a minor dip, reflecting initial investor panic. Within 20 minutes, the decline became a free fall. Institutional shareholders initiated automated sell orders. Pension funds purged their portfolios. The stock value dropped by 65% before the closing bell rang. Billions of dollars in projected revenue evaporated into the ether. Rowena Sarah spent his entire adult life worshiping at the altar of market capitalization. He measured human worth by profit margins and quarterly earnings. I sat in my quiet laboratory watching the financial broadcast on a small muted television screen. I watched the numerical representation of my father's ego burn to ash. The Food and Drug Administration did not merely halt the distribution of the medication. They launched a full-scale criminal probe into the executive regulatory filings. Federal agents arrived at the Greenwich corporate headquarters on a Tuesday morning carrying empty cardboard boxes and sweeping search warrants. They seized hard drives. They confiscated encrypted email servers. They interviewed terrified junior technicians who confessed to altering the longitudinal safety data under direct orders from senior management. The media broadcasted the raid using high-definition helicopter footage. I watched men in dark windbreakers carry away the physical evidence of my father's deception. Corporate loyalty is a fragile illusion. The board of directors at Apex did not hesitate to protect their own interests. They convened an emergency weekend session. They did not invite the chief executive officer. By Monday morning, the board issued a sterile public press release. Richard was stepping down, effective immediately, to spend more time with his family. The polite corporate phrasing translated to a forced, disgraced retirement. The board stripped him of his executive severance package, citing severe breaches of ethical fiduciary duty. They offered him up as a sacrificial lamb to appease the federal investigators and the incoming wave of class action lawsuits. 2 weeks later, the autumn weather turned bitter cold. I sat at the kitchen island in my apartment reviewing the final architectural blueprints for the new clinical testing wing. My smartphone vibrated against the granite countertop. The caller identification displayed a Connecticut area code. It was a number I did not recognize. I let the call go to the automated routing system. A minute later, a notification popped up, indicating a new voice message. I tapped the screen and pressed play. The audio began with a sharp, ragged intake of breath. "Rowena, please pick up the phone." It was Patricia. My mother sounded entirely unrecognizable. The polished, high society cadence she spent decades perfecting was gone. Her voice shook with raw, frantic desperation. I listened to the audio recording feeling a strange clinical detachment. "We are losing everything, Rowena." My mother wept into the receiver. "The federal prosecutors froze your father's domestic assets pending the fraud investigation. The country club revoked our membership. None of our friends will return my calls. The bank issued a formal notice of foreclosure on the Greenwich estate this morning. We have 30 days to vacate the property." I took a slow sip of my black coffee. The dark roast tasted rich and grounding. I stared out the window, watching the bare branches of the oak tree sway in the wind. "You have to help us," Patricia begged, her voice cracking into a high-pitched sob. "You just secured that enormous round of ethical funding for your protein trials. You are a multimillionaire now. We are your family, Rowena. We need a loan. Just enough to save the house and hire a decent defense attorney for your father. Please, you cannot just leave us out here to drown." The message clicked and beeped, signaling the end of the recording. I placed my ceramic mug onto the granite counter. I analyzed the contents of her plea the same way I analyzed a flawed scientific hypothesis. Patricia did not apologize for discarding me when I was 15 years old. She did not express remorse for allowing my high school chemistry teacher to mock my intellect. She did not apologize for sitting silently in a restaurant while my father threatened to destroy my independent laboratory. She only invoked the concept of family when she needed a financial bailout. The irony was sharp and poetic. 11 years ago, I walked out of that sprawling Connecticut mansion with $42 in my pocket and a canvas duffel bag. I survived on expired vending machine pretzels and slept on vinyl basement cots. They knew I was struggling. They knew I was working 3 jobs to pay my university tuition. They never offered a single cent to ensure my survival. They preferred to watch me starve, hoping the poverty would force me to submit to their authority. Now, the roles were reversed. The architects of my suffering were begging for my charity. I did not need to ask about Chloe. The financial news blogs already documented my sister's tragic societal collapse. Julian Sterling operated on the exact same ruthless principles as my father. The venture capitalist married Chloe because she represented a strategic alliance with a pharmaceutical dynasty. She was a pristine corporate asset. When the Apex stock plummeted to zero, her value evaporated. Julian did not want a wife tethered to a disgraced, indicted family. Julie executed the divorce proceedings with the same surgical detachment he used to liquidate underperforming startup companies. He deployed a team of predatory family law attorneys. They drafted a suffocating, ironclad prenuptial enforcement strategy. Chloe attempted to fight the separation in court, but Julian possessed the capital to bury her in procedural motions. He utilized the exact same legal starvation tactics Richard previously deployed against me. Chloe experienced the terrifying reality of fighting an opponent who viewed litigation as a simple business expense. She lost the Boston penthouse. She lost the luxury vehicles. She walked away with a minimal settlement barely sufficient to cover her own legal fees. The golden child lost her gilded cage. Chloe dedicated her entire existence to following our parents' instructions. She played the obedient pageant daughter. She spied on her own sister to steal proprietary formulas. She traded her moral compass for a trust fund. When the trust fund dried up, she was left with nothing. She possessed no independent career and no genuine skills. The tabloids reported she moved back into the Greenwich estate just in time to watch the bank nail a foreclosure notice to the front door. The entire toxic system they built upon a foundation of arrogance and cruelty collapsed under its own heavy weight. I looked down at my smartphone. The screen displayed the option to return the call or reply with a text message. A younger version of myself might have felt the temptation to engage. A bitter, bruised version of Rowena might have drafted a long, vindictive response, detailing every single grievance from the past decade. I could have listed their failures. I could have screamed into the phone and demanded the apologies I always deserved. But therapy and time taught me a vital lesson about dealing with predators. Predators thrive on engagement. They feed on emotional reactions. Any response, even a rejection, validates their belief that they still hold a place in your mind. I did not want revenge. Revenge requires extending your own energy toward the people who hurt you. I wanted peace. I tapped the small red trash can icon on the digital interface. The frantic, weeping voicemail vanished from my device, permanently deleted into the digital ether. I navigated to the phone settings menu. I typed in the Connecticut phone number. I tapped the block contact button. I opened my email server and established a rigid digital filter, sending any correspondence containing the Sarah family domain directly into the spam folder. I established strict, unyielding boundaries. Establishing boundaries is often misunderstood as an act of cruelty. Society conditions daughters to act as emotional sponges for their broken families. We are taught to forgive, to reconcile, to keep the peace at the expense of our own sanity. We are instructed to offer grace to the very people who pushed us into the fire. I rejected that conditioning entirely. Protecting my peace was not a hostile act. It was an act of profound self-preservation. True justice does not always require a dramatic courtroom monologue or a screaming match in the rain. Sometimes, true justice is simply walking away and refusing to look back while the bridge burns behind you. I refused to spend a single fraction of a penny to rescue the people who threw me away. I owed them nothing. They gambled their empire on a toxic lie, and the house finally called the debt. Let them sell their designer clothes. Let them learn how to navigate the public transit system. Let them experience the exact same terrifying financial freefall they forced me to endure when I was a teenager. I turned off my phone and slid it into my pocket. The silence in my apartment felt thick and luxurious. The ghosts of my childhood no longer haunted the corners of my mind. I picked up my architectural blueprints and rolled them into a neat cylinder. I had a new laboratory to build. I had a clinical trial to launch. I had a world to heal. 2 years passed since the day the financial markets erased the apex corporate dynasty. Time moves differently when you stop fighting for survival and start building for the future. The autumn sunlight poured through the vaulted glass skylights of the B. Sarah Institute of Neuroscience. The building stood tall in the center of the Boston Biomedical District, a gleaming structure of brushed steel and transparent walls. I designed the architecture to serve as the exact opposite of the stifling Greenwich mansion I grew up in. That house was built to intimidate and exclude. This institute was engineered to illuminate. I wanted a facility where brilliant minds never had to shrink themselves to fit inside a dark basement ever again. I stood near the window of my corner office on the 4th floor. The space felt expansive, but grounded. I walked over to the small brewing station against the far wall and poured a fresh cup of dark roast. The rich, bitter aroma of black coffee filled the room, cutting through the sterile scent of the sanitized air. I held the warm ceramic mug in both hands, letting the heat seep into my palms. I stepped toward the interior glass partition that overlooked the primary clinical testing floor. I watched my team operate in the space below. Dozens of scientists moved fluidly between the pristine white workstations and the advanced imaging suites. The low, steady mechanical hum of the high-speed centrifuges created a soothing, rhythmic baseline. I did not hire legacy admissions candidates. I did not recruit the polished, arrogant descendants of wealthy venture capitalists. I searched the country for the brilliant, hungry outcasts. I hired the postdoctoral researchers who lost their university funding because they refused to compromise their ethical standards. I hired the women who endured years of being told their hypotheses lacked logical rigor. I assembled an army of scientists who knew exactly what it felt like to be dismissed. Watching them work with unhindered intellectual freedom was the greatest reward of my life. The clinical trials for protein RS7 were currently navigating the final phase of federal regulatory approval. Our data remained immaculate. The protein continued to degrade the toxic neural plaques without triggering a single instance of neuroinflammation. We were mere months away from delivering a genuine, non-toxic treatment to millions of patients suffering from cognitive decay. The legacy of my aunt lived on in every single synthesized batch we produced. Bea lost her own memory, but she provided the key to saving the memories of countless others. But the scientific breakthroughs only represented one half of our mission. The Institute operated as much more than a commercial research facility. We allocated a significant percentage of our clinical revenue to establish a permanent educational foundation. We created a dedicated scholarship program specifically targeting young women emerging from marginalized or unsupportive domestic environments. We instructed our academic scouts to bypass the standard Ivy League feeder schools. We told them to look for the high school students who sat in sterile guidance counselor offices and listened to men tell them that science was a boys' club. We sought out the girls who packed their own duffel bags in the middle of the night. We found the teenagers who possessed raw, undeniable intellect, but lacked the financial resources to escape their toxic families. The Institute stepped in and removed the financial starvation tactics that abusive parents use to enforce compliance. We funded their undergraduate tuition. We paid for their campus housing and their meal plans. We purchased their textbooks, their laboratory equipment, and their safety goggles. We provided them with independent research stipends, so they never had to choose between studying molecular biology and working 3 jobs to pay the rent. We handed these young women the exact same invisible armor Aunt Bea handed me. We gave them the financial independence required to tell their oppressors to walk away. Sometimes I looked down at the entry lobby and watched the new scholarship recipients arrive for their orientation tours. I saw the familiar mixture of sheer terror and fierce determination in their eyes. I remembered exactly how it felt to stand on the edge of a new life with $42 in my pocket. Now I possess the power to ensure none of those girls ever had to walk that road alone. My father was currently navigating a sprawling labyrinth of federal indictments and bankruptcy hearings. He traded his custom-tailored charcoal suits for endless hours sitting inside drab government deposition rooms. Patricia and Chloe vanished into the quiet obscurity of a modest apartment, relying on dwindling legal settlements from their respective divorces. Their glittering high society world dissolved, leaving them with nothing but the bitter echo of their own arrogance. I did not follow their legal battles in the press. I did not track their whereabouts. I did not waste my energy hoping they felt remorse. The opposite of love is not hatred. The opposite of love is profound, permanent indifference. My family spent 17 years trying to convince me I was a worthless secondary asset. I spent the last 2 years proving my worth to the only person who actually mattered. I proved it to myself. I took another slow sip of my coffee, watching a young female technician chart a complex protein sequence on a digital whiteboard below. Her marker moved with quick, confident strokes. She did not hesitate. She knew she belonged in that room. I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of peace settle over my shoulders. I stepped back from the glass and walked toward my desk. I want to speak directly to you now. If you are watching this video and you recognize your own reflection in my story, I need you to listen very closely. You do not owe your loyalty to people who view your brilliance as a threat. You do not owe your silence to protect the fragile egos of the people who were supposed to protect you. You do not owe your forgiveness to family members who only want you back when you become profitable or convenient. Society conditions us to act as emotional sponges for our broken families. We are taught to keep the peace, to endure the insults, and to shrink ourselves down so others can feel large. We are told that setting boundaries is an act of cruelty. That is a lie engineered by people who benefit from your submission. Leaving a toxic environment is not a betrayal. Refusing to finance your own abuse is not a crime. You are allowed to walk out of the room when they refuse to respect your mind. You are allowed to build your own laboratory. You are allowed to write your own formulas, and when they look you in the eye and tell you that you do not belong in their room, you go out and you buy the building. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If this story resonated with you, if it sparked something real and powerful inside your chest, please hit the like button and subscribe to Sophia Told Stories. Sharing this video helps reach the people who desperately need to hear this message today. I want to hear from you. Have you ever walked away from an environment that tried to diminish your potential? Have you ever proved the doubters wrong by simply surviving and succeeding on your own terms? The comments section is yours to fill. Drop your stories, your victories, and your thoughts below. I read every single one. Keep building your own legacy, and I will see you in the next story. Rowena's journey leaves us with 6 profound truths about rewriting the narrative you were handed. First, she shattered the archaic gender stereotype that science belongs to a specific club, proving that genuine brilliance answers to no one's predetermined societal limitations. Second, she mastered the art of turning doubt into raw fuel. The crushing discouragement from her parents and teachers didn't extinguish her fire, but rather ignited a resilient spirit of self-affirmation. Third, she modeled what it means to truly own your path. From leaving in the dead of night to grinding through Caltech, she showed us that if you don't boldly claim your future, someone else will happily script your failure. Fourth, her story champions the quiet dignity of long-term perseverance. The brutal 11-year gap between her exile and her breakthrough serves as an inspiring, realistic antidote to the modern illusion of overnight success. Fifth, she demonstrated that the highest form of triumph carries a profound social impact, proving that our deepest personal rejections can eventually birth a cure that serves the broader community. Finally, she redefined the concept of inspiration, delivering a powerful twist by acknowledging that the very people who opposed her were the ones who inadvertently built her throne. If you have ever had to build your own table because they refused to give you a seat, please subscribe to Sophia Told Stories and share your journey with us in the comments. The core message is simple: you are never defined by what others think you cannot do. Yet, as the dust settles on our own personal battles, we are left staring at the bridges we had to burn just to stay warm. We spend so much time running from the shadows cast by the people who were supposed to protect us, only to realize that the dark is exactly where our eyes learned to see the truth. You finally get everything you ever worked for, and in the quiet of your own mind, you have to wonder if the fire inside you was always yours, or if it was just the spark they left behind when they tried to burn you down.